It is Friday, and we are working for Crusoe. We are back after a week's hiatus. Friday, May 30th, 2025 in Los Angeles, East Park. In Los Angeles, I'm John Ramey. Happy to be back with all of you. It is the penultimate day of May, which is astonishing. And we're going to talk about ASEAN. We're going to talk about Gaza and the humanitarian crisis there. Increased bombardment of Ukraine by Russia, and then we will talk tacos. Trump always chickens out. Actually, a concept that we had previously discussed right here on Working for Crusoe, weeks, if not months, before this has set the news cycle alight. So,
actually, I think it was in our last episode.
Last one. That's still 2 weeks ago.
Yeah, it does seem like a long time ago now. Yeah.
All right. Let's start with ASEAN. Just a very, very quick reminder from Wikipedia. ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, is a regional grouping of 10 states in Southeast Asia that aims to promote economic and security cooperation among its 10 members. The member states represent a population of more than 600 million people and a land area of over 4.5 million square kilometers. So it's a big group. Dateline Kuala Lumpur. Malaysia, Reuters, the South Asian bloc, ASEAN, on Tuesday announced an ambitious strategic plan that includes harmonizing trade standards and greater financial integration in an effort to collectively become the world's fourth largest economy. That currently belongs to India, that honor. The 5-year 41-page plan for the 10-member association, released during a leaders' summit in Malaysia, calls for increased regional trade, freer movement of businesses and people, enhanced transparency and regulatory practices, sustainable mining, industry, and farming policies to attract foreign investment. Basically, all these countries are getting on the same page to form a united front against chaos coming from the United States, more or less.
Yes, and also to have a stronger negotiating position vis-a-vis China, who is an enormous trading partner with all of these nations individually and also as a group. And China, let's face it, is the economic behemoth in their neighborhood. And so it behooves them to be able to have a larger bloc to negotiate with China as well as with anybody else, for that matter.
And I failed to point out, let's just quickly list the member states. Brunei, Cambodia, Indonesia, Laos, Malaysia, Myanmar, Philippines, Singapore, Thailand, Vietnam. So, yeah, these are all the other countries that have to deal with, as you say, the behemoth of China, both economically and geographically.
Exactly. And in a way, they're attempting to follow in the footsteps of the European Union, right? They're nowhere near close to being as integrated as the EU, but that is sort of the long-term goal of ASEAN. And the measures that you outlined just now are really them pushing towards that goal in a more concrete way. Now, they're, as I say, very far behind, but I think that the EU, although they might not have explicitly identified it as their model, it really seems clear that that's what they're trying to achieve.
I know we want to talk more about the economic implications of the ASEAN summit, but there was a sports headline, Sam, that I did think maybe encapsulated the moment of the rise of the global South. ESPN reporting that an unheralded ASEAN All-Stars side pulled off what they term a remarkable 1-0 win over Manchester United, who are the Yankees of English Premier League soccer. It was supposed to be a friendly, but this is kind of a cap to what has been a dismal season to Manchester United, and ASEAN's All-Stars beat them. So I thought that was kind of interesting.
Well, I mean, it makes perfect sense, though. I mean, ASEAN is
it is fitting.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's, lots of nations in ASEAN, right? So you have an enormous number of players that you can select your team from, right? So, Manchester United, for all, their economic might, is still just one team, right? And they have to compete for players with a number of other teams around the world. And so if you're going up against 10 different nations who all get to pick their best players. I think that it's kind of surprising I mean, that is, it's not surprising that they were able to beat United, honestly.
It's another podcast as to why media and sports observers would term it surprising, as you bring up that point. You also sent me a link to a Global Times article, which was the Chinese Communist Party's English language official kind of response or write-up of the ASEAN summit. What to make of it?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of, for instance, the Chinese prime minister was in attendance at the summit, which
That's
by
Li
its,
Qiang.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Li Qiang was there. And so that's a big deal. That's a high level meeting with ASEAN, and that is between ASEAN and China. They also welcomed the large delegation from the Gulf Cooperation Council. That is the same body that President Trump was addressing on his trip to the Middle East that we covered recently. Right? And so, for example, on the eve and leading up to Liberation Day, that is our president's announcement of sweeping tariffs against essentially every nation of the world, there was a lot of concern that the response among other nations would be to sort of reciprocate and also adopt more protectionist trade policies. And I think we can be very relieved that this has not happened. The only real move in that direction was the retaliation of China against the United States, which seems to have worked out very well for them, right? They were able to sort of bully the Trump administration into backing down from the ridiculously high tariffs that they had announced in retaliation for the Chinese retaliation. Now, there's been some developments on that today, which we'll get to later in our episode. But instead, other nations have been attempting to deepen their trade ties with each other. And I think this is the most important part of that is the most important element of this story about ASEAN. For instance, the Prime Minister of Malaysia, Anwar Ibrahim, the host of the ASEAN summit, has said during the summit that he would like the ASEAN nations to negotiate with the Trump administration as a bloc in the trade talks that have resulted from Liberation Day. Now, I haven't heard about any response from the Trump administration. That doesn't mean there hasn't been one. They might have very well have said something in response. It just was not reported on because Americans don't care about other nations.
And in fairness, there's also a tsunami of other things inserted into the news cycle.
Exactly, and especially as regards the trade war, right? So there might have been a response. But the point is that that ASEAN, as we've been talking about, is trying to sort of coalesce as a unified bloc in international trade. And so they're not just announcing new deals with China, which they did during the summit, but also with the Gulf nations, right? So if you look at the Gulf nations, Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, et cetera, they're making deals all over the place. It's not just that they're making all these deals with the United States, as they did during the Trump's visit to the Middle East, many of which, by the way, are probably fictional, but they're not trying to cut themselves off from other nations apart from the United States. They're attempting to expand their trade with a host of other nations, including ASEAN, which, as we've been discussing, is a very large bloc. And we can understand how this might benefit everybody. For example, we've talked about Indonesia, which is one of the largest nations in ASEAN. They have enormous nickel deposits, which are very important for battery technology, for electric vehicles, and clean energy in general. And of course, the Gulf nations, especially Saudi Arabia, but all of them have lots of sunshine all at the time, right? So they need all these sorts of things to try and move towards cleaner energy. Now, they have all the oil in the world, so they could use that for their energy, but they'd rather just sell their oil to foreigners, right? Instead of burning it themselves, right? That just leaves more oil to sell instead of consuming it themselves, right? That helps their terms of trade in general. So this is just trying to access more benefits from trade instead of trying to shut themselves off from the rest of the world, as we seem to be attempting to be doing here in the United States.
Right. It's collective bargaining in a sense.
Yes. And it's demonstrating the benefits of free trade amongst all nations. Now, of course, we can talk about whether the benefits from free trade are evenly distributed inside of the individual nations, which in many cases
they're not.
Right? But that's really not about trade.
No, that's about tax policy.
I would say that's about tax policy, but that's a topic for a different time, frankly.
All right, so I'm going to make I'm going to attempt to construct a high school level metaphor about international trade.
Okay.
International trade right now is a red cup kegger, and it feels like the United States is the party attendee at said red cup kegger that's like a little too wasted but like is still participating in the party, but every conversation they enter into, everybody else tries to get away from them.
Yeah, I think that's right.
You know that guy at the party that you're like, oh no, I don't want to get caught talking to this guy for too long.
He's also standing at the front of the line and chugging his red cup, right, and refilling it again before letting the person behind him in the line get to the can.
And so the rest of the world is like, this is a great party if I can just stay away from this guy.
Exactly, right? But that guy ends up being the drunkest of everybody.
Right. All right, that was just my, I don't know how insightful that was, but that's kind of what occurred to me as we just think about everybody else kind of carrying on with the miracle of global trade and not the United States.
No.
Okay. In less cheery tones, let's turn to Gaza. Al Jazeera reporting today that French President Emmanuel Macron has warned that his country could apply sanctions against Israelis unless the government in Tel Aviv, that is the Israeli government, responds to the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. Speaking during a visit to Singapore today, Macron said the international community could not remain passive while Palestinians in Gaza face a deepening hunger crisis. The comments raise further the international pressure building on Israel, which has blockaded the Palestinian enclave for close to 3 months, with aid agencies warning of famine. The Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, a private initiative supported by the U.S. and Israel, expanded its relief operations on Thursday yesterday, but the group's efforts have been widely condemned by the United Nations and other agencies as insufficient, poorly managed, and not adhering to humanitarian principles. Experts warn that 1 in 5 people in Gaza faces imminent starvation.
Yes, it's a nightmare. I'm confident that most of the people tuning in today have seen some of the footage from various news organizations that's been surfacing throughout the week of the just awful debacle of these attempts to really just incredibly inept attempts to feed the people in Gaza. And this Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, so-called, nobody seems to know very much about them, but numerous officials of that same foundation resigned this week because they said that they could not engage in these activities in a humane fashion. And if you look at the map of the facilities that they've been trying to establish in order to distribute this aid, there are 4 of them. 4 throughout the entire Gaza Strip. So they're trying to feed 2 million people from 4 locations, seemingly only one at a time, by the way. And as you mentioned, no food aid had been getting into Gaza for about 11 weeks. And so if you've got 2 million people who've had difficulty finding food for almost 3 months, and you're trying to feed all of them from 4 locations, you are asking for a riot.
So Al Jazeera reports that Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, GHF, centers have become sites of chaos, violence, and desperation, with scenes of disorder running through the week as huge numbers of hungry people have overwhelmed security forces at distribution points.
Yes,
And as
they've
you
been
say,
tearing
one at
down.
a time, distribution point.
They've been tearing down fences. They've been trying to. At one point, the aid was being distributed inside of a very large shed, like a warehouse-sized shed. Right? They tried to tear down the walls of the shed. Well, I mean, which is, I mean, you have to expect that this sort of thing is going to happen. By the way, the staff at these facilities are United States private military contractors. Now, the individual people working there might not, in fact, be Americans. They could be from any place. But the point is that the United States is directly implicated in this. Now, you can, there, I guess, say that there's some sort of arm's length distance just because they're private companies. But I don't think that cuts any ice with anybody. And
I mean, if they're getting paid by the government.
yes. Meanwhile, at the same time, I believe it was Wednesday or perhaps yesterday that the Israeli government has announced that they're expanding settlements in the West Bank. That is, there are going to be 22 newly approved settlements, right? Some of which were illegal already. They were called outposts. And this is the largest.
Illegal by international law.
That's right. This is the largest expansion of Israeli settlements in the West Bank in 30 years. And so at this point, and it's awful to have to say this, but at this point, I think the idea of a future Palestinian state is gradually receding from reality. Now, I hope I'm wrong about that, but it just doesn't seem as if there will be any momentum in the future for establishing this. President Trump doesn't seem to care at all. He has actually said recently, I should say, that he doesn't like seeing the scenes of starvation in Gaza. He doesn't think it's a good thing to happen. But he's not doing anything at all to stop it. He's not putting any pressure on Netanyahu to stop this. Now, we keep hearing, and we have today and yesterday, that there's some momentum towards a peace settlement between Israel and Hamas brokered by the United States. I hope that something along those lines can be brought to fruition. But is it going to be any better than the last one that the Trump team helped negotiate in between the election and Trump's inauguration? Hopefully it'll be better, but I'm not confident about that.
I mean, just as somebody who on this podcast has repeatedly expressed dismay and outrage at how Israel defending itself has come under furious, frankly, at times anti-Semitic criticism. And we've gone through the metaphors of, we firebombed and nuked our opponents when we were attacked in living memory. Right. It is never a pleasant or particularly humane thing to defend your country after an attack and to secure safety for your populace. But the one thing the Allies didn't do, even though they nuked and firebombed and pulverized the enemies in the Second World War, they didn't starve anybody deliberately.
Not that I'm aware of, no.
Not that I'm aware of, right? Like, and that's, I don't really know how. I don't know how you can put these actions, this humanitarian crisis, under the Israel defending itself.
No, I don't think you can at all.
Like,
honestly, I mean, the Israelis
is that intellectually honest? I mean, I guess your point that maybe they're wiping out any possible Palestinian state in future negotiations. I guess a cynical, perhaps far right Israeli voice might say, well, that's part of Israel securing itself, but that's illegal. I mean, that's immoral and illegal.
I understand that, but that doesn't mean it's not going to happen.
No, it's terrible.
And for instance, Prime Minister Netanyahu himself has said that they intend to occupy all of Gaza. And in accordance, by the way, with Donald Trump's plan to open some Riviera-style resort there. Now, I I don't think he actually means that. I think that they're just doing it in order to secure more land for the state of Israel, just as the expansion of settlements is directed towards that same outcome. But I'm sorry, this is indefensible. Now, the Israelis will say, and they're right, that October 7th was the deadliest day for Jews worldwide since the Holocaust. But it's not the same. All right. During the Holocaust, the Jews of Europe didn't have any way of defending themselves. And Israel does. And Israel did on October 7th, but they failed to do so. Now, that doesn't excuse Hamas by any stretch of the imagination.
And we should point out that Israel's military operation to this point has more or less wiped out Hamas. Hamas doesn't exist as a terrorist threat anymore.
That's right. I would think that they don't, but Israel would never admit that, right? Every time that they've been launching one of their innumerable airstrikes, which they're continuing to do, they're saying we targeted Hamas operatives, right? And yeah, if you keep pushing all the residents of Gaza into an increasingly smaller space, then yeah, you're gonna,
your shrapnel will hit somebody who had something to do with Hamas.
Yeah, and you're going to hit more people than you would have before you pushed them into that smaller space. That's just the math. And so they don't really seem to care about that. This is a heartbreaking story to me, and I don't see any good end of it. I mean, if Donald Trump is going to keep shielding the Israelis from any sort of accountability on this, then he's going to be president for another 3 years. And if this continues for that length of time, it's just going to be a ghastly outcome. But to return to the element that you started this segment with, Macron is not the only European leader that's been declaiming against the Israelis this week. Keir Starmer, Friedrich Merz, and increasingly, all the European nations are breaking away from the United States in this sort of rhetoric. And up until now, they have been a little reluctant to put a lot of distance between their positions and the American position. That reluctance is fading.
The problem with that, Sam, is European countries are more anti-Semitic than the United States. And
yes,
so
they are.
Their criticisms, I find a little more ideologically driven sometimes for convenient political purposes.
I agree with that. All right. But
I'm not saying that criticisms can't happen. I'm just saying it's tougher to take from those countries.
I understand, but the point I'm
even though they're
making,
right in this case, starvation bad, like that's not anti-Semitism.
The point, for instance, it's one thing for some member of parliament in a European nation to level anti-Semitic criticisms against Israel. It's another thing entirely for Macron and Starmer to do this sort of thing. I saw a scene from the Bundestag, the German parliament, in which a member of parliament was saying that Germany should cut off arms sales to Israel. And by the way, this is the sort of flip side of what we're talking about, is that politicians can say whatever they want. The fact is that all of these countries still support Israel militarily, and they're a good customer, I assume. Yes, along with things like intelligence overflights that help guide the airstrikes. So until they're actually willing to stop that, they're just talking. But the point is that the talking is a departure from what normally we would see in this sort of case.
Again, we've been covering this since it happened, since October 7th.
Yes, and unfortunately, we'll have to keep doing so.
And, at the very outset of that, it was, how do we even talk about this? Because, there are layers upon layers of complexity. And,
But as time goes on, those layers
starvation
are being stripped away.
Right. 1 in 5 people starving is not complex.
Yes. As Hamas becomes gradually weakened and all of Iran's other proxy forces are essentially non-entities now, this is becoming a far less complex situation as time goes on.
Yeah. Speaking of another not particularly complex international crisis, let's talk about Russia bombing Ukraine a lot. The BBC reporting Ukraine's President Vladimir Zelensky has alleged that the U.S.'s silence after recent Russian attacks is encouraging President Vladimir Putin following Moscow's largest aerial attack yet. The overnight attack last weekend, Saturday into Sunday, saw Russia fire 367 drones and missiles, the highest number in a single night since Putin launched a full-scale invasion in 2022. At least 12 people, including 3 children, were killed and dozens more injured in widespread strikes across Ukraine. They came a day after one of the heaviest assaults on the capital, Kyiv, in months. Zelensky, quote, "This cannot be ignored. America's silence and the silence of others in the world only encourages Putin," end of quote. U.S. President Donald Trump reacted late on Sunday by telling reporters, quote, "I'm not happy with what Putin is doing. He's killing a lot of people," end of quote. And then at some point he took to social media.
Yes. And I mean, this is just ridiculous on Trump's behalf. And
he's a ridiculous figure.
Well, yes, but I mean, he's saying things like, and we shouldn't go into a great amount of detail about this. He says, "I don't know what happened to Putin." This is a statement that's half right, right? Trump is entirely correct when he says that he doesn't know, right? But he's wrong to say that something happened to Putin, right?
No,
Putin,
it's just that his assessment has been 100% wrong from the word go.
That's right. And these enormous airstrikes that Russia has been mounting against Ukraine took place just a few days after Trump had something like a 2-hour phone call with Putin, which he seemed to think went very well. And so Trump talks to Putin. Putin says nice things to him. And then the very next thing he does is level a record-setting attack against Ukraine. And Trump seems surprised by this, right? He's still saying things like, "Oh, I've known him a long time. We have a very good relationship." Well, do you? I mean, it's just ridiculous. He seems to think, and seemed to think during his electoral campaign, that just by coming back into the White House, his great friend Vladimir Putin would, just suddenly change his ways, right? And he still doesn't seem to understand that he was wrong about that. Here and there, if Zelensky can talk to him, for instance, at the funeral of what was the name of the last pope? I can't even remember. But the funeral, the funeral of Pope Francis in the Vatican a few weeks ago, there was the really, honestly, very moving pictures of Trump and Zelensky sitting knee to knee with no one else around them. At that point, Trump seemed to be able to get a little bit closer to Zelensky in terms of his rhetorical positioning. But over and over again, he'll always go back to Putin, right? He cannot get it through his mind that Putin doesn't want peace. He seems to believe that Putin does want it, and in the face of all the available evidence.
Yeah, it's almost like one guy's a failed wannabe real estate mogul who played an executive on television, and the other guy is a KGB killer who's been running one of the world's largest nuclear arsenals for the better part of 30 years.
That's right. And Putin is, I think, he's the leader that Trump most admires, the one that Trump would most like to be. And he can't, right? There's just no, I mean, in a way, we should be happy here in the United States that Trump doesn't have it in him to be as ruthless and brutal an authoritarian leader as Vladimir Putin is. Now, that doesn't mean he's not going to do enormous damage to our own country, right? But he's not at this point in that same league.
Okay. Speaking of our president, we have a ruling from a federal appeals court yesterday that relates to our larger topic of taco, as in Trump always chickens out, regarding tariffs. CNBC reporting a federal appeals court on Thursday yesterday granted the Trump administration's request to temporarily pause a lower court ruling that struck down most of President Donald Trump's tariffs. The Trump administration had earlier told the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit that it would seek, quote, emergency relief from the Supreme Court as soon as Friday, that is today, if the tariff ruling was not quickly put on pause. Basically, a court said Trump's tariffs are illegal. The Trump administration then said, I'm going to take this to the Supreme Court if you, U.S. Court of Appeals, don't rule to put a pause on this ruling. Is that right?
Yes. The Court for International Trade had said that Trump didn't have the authority to impose the sweeping tariffs. That was on Wednesday. And then the United States Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit put a stay on that ruling. Now, the Court for Trade had initially given the Trump administration 10 days to wind down the tariffs. And so basically none of this adds up to much at all. But it is the first court ruling about the tariffs. So that's what's significant about this, is that there's some question about as to whether or not Trump has the legal authority to engage in the trade war at all.
So, Mr. President, not only are your Trump's atrociously stupid policy, they're also illegal?
Yes. But even the Court for International Trade gave the Trump administration an out. They said there are other laws you could probably have invoked in order to do this. And I kind of feel like Trump wanted to use the International Economic Emergency Powers Act, or IEPA, because it contains the word emergency, right? And this, an authoritarian leader always needs to be governing in a state of emergency.
Right. He couldn't get something through Congress to make a law that would make this all copacetic.
That's right. And so,
or he chooses not to.
Yeah. And so the idea, these other laws that he could possibly use, they're just standard trade laws, right? They're not, a declaration of some national crisis, which seems to be important to the Trump administration. But of course, this was in some ways almost overshadowed by the reporter from CNBC again, Megan Cassella, who in the White House on Wednesday.
Oh, was she the one who asked the question?
Asked Trump about the taco trade, which we reported on, or that is, we shared the reporting from the Financial Times commentator Robert Armstrong a couple weeks ago, who first mentioned this term that he had gotten from financial professionals who were using it in terms of their own trading strategies.
Sure.
That is, Trump always chickens out, right?
All right. So lest anybody think this is just liberal media hit piece, Shannon Pettypiece wrote an article on NBC that outlines 10 tariffs on which Trump has chickened out. Would you like to hear them, Sam?
Not especially. Maybe of 2 or 3. You don't
Let's
have to
rip through them. EU, wine, Canada and Mexico, films, iPhones, dolls, cars. Those are just some of the highlights. Like, it's happened.
Yes, over and over again. I mean, it's happened
This is not some lefty hit piece trying to be meme and viral.
Yes. Now, of course, Trump got very upset about this when Megan Cassella asked him this question. Right?
Donald Trump's a very sensitive person.
Yes, and Robert Armstrong himself has made a couple of TV appearances in the aftermath of Cassella asking that question. And I saw him on MSNBC yesterday saying, Trump chickening out is a good thing. And if he hadn't backed off on these tariffs, we might already be in an economic crisis. And we should be happy that we're not. And he basically was hoping that Megan Cassella asking this question wouldn't provoke Trump into reinstituting some of the tariffs just to prove that he's not a chicken. And almost on cue, today, Trump is accusing China of backing out or not living up to the terms of the non-deal, basically, that they executed with the United States a couple weeks ago in Geneva. And so hopefully he won't actually reinstitute the tariffs against China, but he seems to be hinting that he might do this. And so
right on cue, the markets are down.
That's
actually,
right.
Dow Jones just ticked into positive territory.
Oh, good. I'm so happy. Yeah. But that's the taco trade. They don't think he's actually going to do it. I think we're missing a press conference in the White House right now. And so perhaps Trump didn't say anything about retaliatory tariffs. But his officials are manning the cameras, trying to mitigate the damage here. Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary today, said that he's confident, that is, quote, confident that the Chinese will come to the table when President Trump makes his preferences known.
Well, that hasn't happened in 40 years.
It's like, what? He hasn't made his preferences known already? What do you think you're doing? What kind of negotiation is that? But again, if we think Trump always chickens out, if the markets are ticking into positive territory now, I'm suspecting that he might have chickened out again.
I forget who said this. It was on one of the podcasts that we enjoy, Sam, probably somebody on Ezra Klein's podcast, who described both in the first and now the second Trump administrations, Donald Trump doesn't have any kind of doctrine or philosophy or really any guiding principles whatsoever. He'll say something insane and detrimental to the markets or whatever. And then everybody else who, as you say, mans the camera essentially has a Zamboni-like function. This was the brilliant, I thought, metaphor of it, right?
Yeah, I think that's right.
Trump does something to the ice, and then the rest of the administration and now the Republican apparatus has to kind of smooth it over and attempt to make some coherent sense of what he has said.
Yeah, it's pathetic.
Yeah. Okay, good episode. That was fun. Nice to be back in the saddle.
Yes. Now, next week, we'll be looking at the upcoming Polish presidential election finals. That is the second round results, which are happening over the weekend. And we'll compare it to the Romanian presidential election, which we missed, but they're comparable stories, so we can group them into one. Also, we'll be getting the jobs report for May, and that will come on top of a lot of economic data that we're already getting this week. So we'll group all that together also.
All right. He's Sam. I'm John. Have a great weekend. We'll talk to you next Friday.
Thanks, everybody.